Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the book club. We're finishing off October with The Secret Life of Houdini on Halloween. This is Halloween today, coincidentally, the same day that Houdini died. Houdini died in 1926 on Halloween, October 31st. The book that we're discussing is The Secret Life of Houdini uh, by William Kalush and Larry Sloman. If you know who William Kalush is, he runs Conjuring Arts Research Center and he's a historian in magic. He's also an author. He's does a lot of work behind the scenes in magic, producing David Blaine shows, helping David Blaine with a lot of shows and other magic shows as well. Larry Sloman is a world famous author. Larry Sloman has written several autobiographies, ghost written, with many famous people in the world. Bob Dylan, David Blaine. He's just done a biography with Mike Tyson, an autobiography with Mike Tyson. Um, so he is I've read a couple of his books. He's a great author, and the whole goal of this book was to tell Houdini's life story, but as if it were actually happening for us, and it was Houdini telling it. And I think they did a pretty good job on this book. It's a pretty big book. It has 610 pages, and that is for the original book, The Secret Life of Houdini. If you look at they also have a second volume, which is just a book full of all the endnotes and an explanation of that. If you want to get that, it comes together in a collector's edition set. I believe that's for sale on the Conjuring Arts website. So if you do want to buy this book and you haven't bought it, either way, buy it from Conjuring Arts because the money will go directly to the authors rather than just going to some company that then they get a royalty from. Buy it from there, and if you want to get the two book set, I would get it from there as well. That's conjuringarts.org. I believe it's .org, but Conjuring Arts, you can find it. So, The Secret Life of Houdini, the making of America's first superhero. This is the concept that Houdini was the first superhero in the world, the first guy, the first American superhero, a guy who everybody looked up to as being able to do impossible things. I don't know how much that is true. I don't know if he was the first, but he was definitely one of the biggest, if not the biggest. Everybody still knows Houdini's name nowadays, even though we are many, many years after his birth. I believe Houdini was born in, let's just check it out. Houdini was born in 1874, March 24th, 1874, in Budapest, Hungary. And he came over to America as a child with his family. His father was a rabbi, and the book starts with him being nobody and starving for a living to learning how to do magic and eventually build himself up as a magician, get Bess in his show. For those of you who know who Bess Houdini is, it was his wife. He met her. She used to be a singer. They were doing magic together on vaudeville, different acts, and he convinced her to join him in his show, and they sort of just fell in love and spend the rest of their life together on the road. In this story of magic intersects with so many extraordinary magicians, from Keller, who was a huge fan of Houdini. I really believe that Harry Keller wanted Houdini to succeed him and not Howard Thurston. I think Howard Thurston was in a better financial position, which is why he was able to get that title of Keller's successor in Magic. But I think it was Houdini that was Keller's real successor, and definitely Keller held high regard for Houdini. They uh, communicated throughout their life. This is a book that has been written with the extensive aid of Houdini's personal diaries. For those of you who don't know, Houdini kept diaries. He kept a diary for pretty much every single day of his life, writing things in there that, I mean, he wrote everything in there. And he also kept letters. People used to communicate by letters, and there are thousands of letters from Houdini and other people. So this book was written with those sources used. The collection of Houdini's letters are sort of scattered around the world. I know David Copperfield has a bunch. William Kalush has a bunch. Ricky Jay has a bunch. They're sort of spread throughout. There's a lot of people who are not into magic, who are just Houdini collectors. They collect Houdini related artifacts, and they own a lot of those letters. Houdini's diaries, on the other hand, as far as I know, they're owned by a they're owned by someone who's very private. This person has never really made themselves known. I can't share the name of them, but their name is not so important. But somebody does own Houdini's diaries, and they're incredibly protective of them. They don't just want them out there. For example, they've never just been released to the public. So it is something that's secret, and most magicians have never seen them. There's a few magicians, biographers of Houdini, who have tracked this person down and have gotten permissions to view the diaries. But as far as I know, nobody's been ever given, copies of the diaries. They've been able to look through it and read it and, do what they can in the limited time span that the owner of the diaries has given them. But nobody's been able to really sit down and totally read and document everything, copy everything from these diaries. And I don't even think the authors of this book, Bill Kalush and Larry Sloman, have. I know that they had access to the diaries, but I don't think they were given everything. I don't think anybody has everything other than the owner. The book reads as if you're reading Houdini's thoughts. It's pretty exciting in a way, and they take these. They sort of write the story as if it were happening in front of you. It's pretty cool to see the photos of Houdini's father, Houdini and his family. Houdini had brothers, Theo, and I forget his other brothers' names, but he had a few brothers who, some of them were magicians, some of them were not. There was also things going on inside of the family as years went on that were very disturbing. I remember one instance of one of the brothers basically stealing another of the brothers' wives, and weird circumstances also surrounding Houdini's mother's death that may have involved a medical procedure by one of the sons who was a doctor. I also want to say, I think Houdini's longest living brother, I forget which one it was, but one of his longest living brothers lived until the 70s. I want to say the early 70s or maybe the mid 70s. And he ended up committing suicide. He lived in New York, and he was around for all these years, and he knew a lot of stuff about Houdini. Obviously, he was his brother, and they spent a lot of time together, and he knew things involving the family. Nobody ever interviewed him, even though he lived so long. So it's quite a shame. He ended his life jumping out of his office window, if you can believe it. Harry Houdini was born Eric Weiss, um, and the Eric is a very Hungarian spelling. It's Ehrich, and Weiss is a very, I don't know, very Jewish spelling. I know that there's debate over the spelling, whether it's one way or another. You can look at the debate online. It's quite interesting, but I'm not too concerned with his name. We know that he, very early on in his career, I think right at the very beginning, well, actually, not at the very beginning. At the very beginning, he started off as an acrobat, and he used the name Eric, the Prince of the Air. And his act was him swinging from ropes and doing contortion feats and, tumbling in old fields and, just it was an acrobatic act, and he was very athletic. There's a photo of Houdini when he's young, and he used to do a lot of competitive athletics, running, and different sports. And you can tell from the photo that Houdini is ripped. I mean, he is in shape. So I find it quite interesting that he started his performing career as an acrobat, but he was from a very poor family. His father was a rabbi slash lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, who was a lot less successful financially than he wanted to appear. And the family struggled because of that. Houdini made a promise to his mother one day when he was a child that one day he's going to make a lot of money and he'll make it rain gold on her. I think he did a magic trick for her. He produced a piece of money from her ear or something, and he said, one day I'm going to make it really rain money for you. That's the promise that he made to her as a child, if I'm not mistaken. By the way, if I say something and I'm mistaken, it's because of my recollections. There's a lot surrounding Houdini, but let's continue. Yes, the promise is right here in the book. There was also a lot of tragedy in Houdini's family. One of his brothers died when Houdini was a child. I think a lot of children died back then. There wasn't as good of healthcare, and many kids who were born did not live to become adults. They died as children. So one of Houdini's brothers died when he was a kid, and anyways, he just had a hard life. I think, as a lot of immigrants at that time had. They had moved to America, to Wisconsin, and yeah, they didn't really have money. Houdini eventually would learn how to make money by performing magic. He would learn magic, and he would read the old magic books that were available at that time. One of his favorite books was the books of Robert Houdin, I believe Confidences, and what is the other book by Robert Houdin? Anyways, Robert Houdin has a few books that were very popular for magicians at that time, and he read them. And as he read them, he wanted to turn magic into a career. He was a huge fan of Robert Houdin, and so he named himself Houdini because he thought Houdin is a French name, and in French, apparently, in his imagination, if you add an E after something, it makes it similar. So he wanted his name to be Houdini. That meant that he would be similar to Robert Houdin. Obviously, that's not correct if you know anything about the French language, but he did not know that at the time. So he named himself Houdini. And he chose the name Harry because his name was Eric. Eric, but his family and his close friends would always call him Airy, instead of Eric, Airy. And so that just turned into Harry, the English pronunciation of Harry, and he was Harry Houdini, which now we sort of know is such a classic name, but back then nobody knew it. It's kind of hard to imagine. Nobody knew it. Houdini at this time was a young man. He was growing up, um, still doing acrobatics, trying to break into magic, trying to build an act. Uh, this is him as a teenager. He was a track star. He was very athletic. He had a few competitions under his belt as a runner. That's what I mean when I say track star. And he was an amateur boxer. He used to box. Um, and try to make money that way as well. And apparently, he was pretty good. If you read it, he was very small. I think he was 115 pounds. By the way, he was 115 pounds, not 150. 115. This is what he when he was 17 years old, and he had just went to New York. And he was just at this time hustling. He he was not a magician, but he was trying to put magic together. And he, as I told you, found Robert Houdin in his book, in the memoirs of Robert Houdin, and he he identified with Robert Houdin. He became enamored with him, almost obsessed, really. And in Houdin, he sort of saw that he could become successful. He didn't have to be this guy who was struggling. He could become successful. So he eventually found a partner to do magic with. This was not Bess. This was a male partner at first, and they performed together at the Brothers Houdini, and they tried to tour with their act. I don't think back then it was a very good act, and I think Houdini was quite a character. He did not get along well with many people, so him and his original partner would always argue, and they broke. They broke the partnership very, very, very young. I think they were. I think Houdini at this time must have been maybe 18 years old, and he was now totally on his own, no partner in magic anymore. He got a letter one day. It was either a letter or a phone call. Somebody came up to him while he was working, and they told him that his father was dying. So he just ran. He literally ran to the nearest bus. He made it home, and as he was making it home, his father was dying, and he literally made it to his father's death. He literally got there, and his father died, and it was I think quite a devastating moment for him. He didn't have a lot of money. He spent a lot of money getting back home, rushing to his father's bedside. His father died, and then he immediately just went back to it. He didn't stay at home. He went back out into the world, working at expositions, um, doing his magic, making connections, trying to develop himself as a performer. If you have seen the old posters of Houdini as the King of Cards, that's what he built himself as back in those times. He sort of had a manipulation act with cards, and he did magic with some apparatus, but not a huge full show. um, he would also, for the first time, find the metamorphosis routine, which is that classic routine. I think it's called the substitution trunk, but he called it the metamorphosis. Although I'm not sure if he's the first one who came up with that name, but it's that classic routine where the magician is put inside of a bag, and then that bag is put inside of a box. The box is locked, and then the woman stands on top of the box. She holds a big curtain. One, two, three. She lifts it over her head, and then the magician pulls it, and the magician is now on top of the box. He climbs down, he opens that box, and the girl is inside the box. Um, that was, classic routine, but Houdini really made it his own. And at that time, he had also met Bess, who they were working together uh, on that show, and they sort of just, I don't know, you just know how it happens. They sort of just met up and started spending time together, and the next thing you know, they were working together and going out, and Bess was perfect for his act. She was small. She was, I think, 4 foot something. She wasn't even 5 feet tall, and she weighed under 90 pounds. So she was pretty small, and she was perfect as a partner for Houdini's act. And he made her a part of his show, and she worked in the show for a very long time after that. But again, Houdini did not become a success overnight. This was at the very beginning of his career. He was not known. He was not respected. I don't think magicians respected Houdini really at this point of his career. I think he was becoming known to other magicians at this point of the career, but he was not known. He was still just developing himself as an artist. Houdini came up with a lot of ideas to promote the shows. Part of doing any show is you got to promote the show and sell tickets and get people to actually show up. And Houdini had this idea of getting himself tied to a horse, like from all corners of a horse, and the horse would rip him up with ropes attached to his arms and his legs if he didn't escape in time. And so he had a method for this, which was horrible, horrible method. I'm not too sure if he was supposed to be ripped up from the horse, but it ended up having him being tied to the horse in some way, and he would be in danger. Anyways, his method so the horse wouldn't kill him was to tire out the horse. So they made the horse run a few miles before the stunt, so that the horse was, totally exhausted. And then they did the stunt. Houdini almost killed himself because he miscalculated how much energy a horse has and how strong a horse is. But I think that was sort of the beginning of him trying to incorporate stunts into into his performance art. Houdini made a rule for himself at that point, and he wrote this in his diary, that you can never practice in public, plan ahead, and be prepared for all contingencies, meaning be prepared for anything that can happen. Houdini started to work on an escape in which he would be tied as as an insane asylum, as an insane a mental patient. He had heard about this, people being tied into straitjackets, uh, but he had never experienced one. So he went to a mental hospital and he asked to to see them, and they actually had a patient at the hospital tied up in a straitjacket, and the patient was just totally raving lunatic, frantically trying to get out. And Houdini was just fixated by that image of somebody trying to escape this device that's meant to hold somebody together. He immediately bought one and he added it to the metamorphosis. He would have himself tied up in the straitjacket, put into the trunk, and then uh, do the trick. And the girl would be, Bess would be in the trunk at the end of the trick inside the straitjacket, just to add an extra level. So these were escapes that were at the very beginning happening in two circumstances. Houdini always did escapes in two different ways. He did escapes that you could see him escaping, and then he did escapes where he was under the veil of something. He was either behind a curtain, or he was in a box, or he was in a milk can, and the milk can was covered by a curtain. So there were two types of escapes. The escapes that you could see him escaping, for example, when he's tied upside down by a straitjacket and he's hanging and everybody's just watching him hanging off the side of the newspaper buildings. He did that to get great publicity. And the other types of escapes where he was hidden. So there was always two sections: escapes in front of people and escapes behind the curtain. And the idea was to let people see some of the escapes so that they think that, man, this guy's really good at escaping. He can escape from anything, but also have some impossible escapes that they don't figure out, that are still escapes, but they have a magical quality to it. For example, he would be put into the milk can. The milk can was padlocked from the outside. If you just go on the internet and Google Houdini milk can, you'll see it's a giant can. It's about, I want to say it's about 4 feet high, maybe it's slightly smaller, and it's wide, and it would be filled with water. And Houdini would climb inside. There's water all the way to the brim. As he climbs inside, the water is spilling all the way out. He holds his breath, dives down, they close the lid, and then they padlock it. They put a lock on the outside and cover it with a curtain. Houdini would be in there for about 3 minutes or so. No one would know what's going on. And then he'd totally just come out, fall through the curtain, soaking wet, his clothes ripped, and no one understood how he got out because they would look at the milk can. The milk can was totally undisturbed. It would still have the lock on it. The lock would be locked. The lid would still be on. And there was no way to get out otherwise. It was sealed. It was not like there were, like a door at the side. This was a solid piece of metal. So he had escapes like that. He also had escapes where he was nailed into coffins, and the coffins would be also hidden by curtains and different stuff. And when he would escape, people would be able to inspect the coffin afterwards. And these were coffins that people would even build on stage, and they would not be able to understand how he got out because everything would be intact. So those were the two types of escapes that he had primarily. I might be missing. He had some other escapes that sort of are in other weird categories. But the idea that I feel is that he had these two different types of escapes to give people both the experience of rooting for him as he's escaping, and also that sense of mystery when he did escapes, that there was just no way that he could possibly get out, and he got out. And they looked at it afterwards and they're like, we don't know how you got out of that, which was pretty cool. Um, it's a pretty cool feeling to be able to give somebody. And Houdini mixed these escapes, these stunts, with his magic as like a force multiplier. He wasn't just a magician, and he wasn't just a an escape artist. They weren't separate. They were combined into this weird thing. Houdini was Houdini. And that's why he had so many imitators throughout his life. Houdini would have a lot of competitors. Some of the competitors were totally fake. Uh, for example, his one of his biggest competitors was his brother Houdini, who is an interesting story. They were sort of competitors, but they were also brothers. And Houdini would give him and sell him his props. And he was a Houdini imitator, but he was a controlled Houdini imitator. If you Google the idea, the concept of controlled opposition, this is what Houdini was doing. Houdini had all these fakes of himself, and some of them were controlled by him. So he could create all this drama around him by making people think that there was actual drama, but he was really in control. And it's sort of like if you look at uh, the different fighting and boxing and martial arts competitions that they have nowadays, a lot of the drama is really drummed up, and uh, it's controlled in a way. The managers are controlling it. There's publicists. They're designing it in order to create hype for the actual live event. This is going to be the fight in between this guy and this guy, and this guy has been talking smack about this guy. Now this guy is talking about this guy's mother, and they're just going back and forth. And are they really enemies? I don't know. They could be, but there's somebody controlling them, and Houdini was one of the first guys who did that sort of in performance, which is pretty interesting if you think about it. It was all to promote himself, um, and not only with imitators, he would do this with police organizations, different police departments. He would challenge them openly, saying that they don't know what they're doing. They can't capture this criminal. They can't capture this criminal. Oh, look, this person escaped from this prison. They're no good. And he would sort of play off of their emotions in order to build publicity. Houdini was just a master showman, a master of getting publicity, making headlines, getting his name and his photo in the paper. There's a reason why he would hang himself upside down from a straitjacket, and he would choose the location of a newspaper building to do that. Back then, all the newspapers and the news media organizations used to work pretty closely together in a single building in some cities, and he would literally hang himself right outside of their window so they could get the perfect shots. Of course, Houdini worked with a lot of people. He used a lot of traditional advertising as well. Advance men, these are people who go to the town a week or two before to help arrange the show, set up publicity, sort of hype people up for the show. If you look up advance men, advance agents, it's a very well-known thing in show business, especially in magic history. Which leads us into the spirit cabinets. Houdini, back in that time, if you guys are familiar with magic history, there was a new phenomenon of spiritualism, which was it was a new branch of a sort of a new age belief, a new age cult that was created by these sisters called the Fox Sisters, and these were sisters who grew up and they would make rapping sounds in the dark, and the rapping sounds were supposed to be spirits communicating with them in the dark, and they created this to a show, and they would give lectures. They were sort of the Uri Gellers of their era, they were claiming that they had real powers to communicate with forces, and they were receiving messages. And it's pretty interesting. Um, One of the sisters later totally turned against the other sisters and came out and said, we're fraudulent. This is all fake, and apologized. The other sister said, no, it's real. She's lying. There was a lot of drama back then. This was in Houdini's era, and after them came the Masculins. If you guys know Neville Masculin and the Davenport brothers, who followed in the Fox sisters' footsteps, continuing this show, which was part performance, part lecture. So the lecture, and what I mean by lecture, not a magic lecture, this was a lecture given to the public. And it was very much in the same format. If you ever look at the old videos of Uri Geller would do a lecture before he would bend any spoons. He would come in and he would talk, he would introduce himself. My name is Uri Geller. In this year I was born, and this happened, and this is what happened in my life. And then I discovered these powers. And what these lectures would be is somebody telling their life story and describing these powers to the people. And the lectures might be half an hour, they might be 45 minutes, an hour. It could be a long time, but they're sort of telling their story as if this is really real. And only then, let me try something. This is sort of what the Fox sisters were doing. They would tell their story, their life story, and then they would demonstrate. And they would demonstrate by rapping in the dark. By what I mean by rapping is there would be like a little knocking sound, sort of like this, if you guys can hear that, in the dark. And their hands and their legs were all, they were not making it apparently with their bodies or their mouths. And they had many ways of making these sounds. One of the ways that they had were by putting their fingers and their toes up against the table and cracking their fingers and their toes. If you like bend your toes or your fingers far back enough, they'll crack, or you can crack your knuckles. That's what they were doing, but the sound would magnify against the table or whatever they were cracking it against. And in that quiet room, they were able to create a performance out of that. Very, very interesting performance. And from that spawned a cult. I don't know if it's a cult, it's a movement. It's a spiritual movement called spiritualism, which is, it had a lot of beliefs. The beliefs were pretty bizarre. Some of the beliefs intersected with aliens and UFOs, and other of the beliefs intersected with the dead. But basically, the basic idea was that when you die, your spirit is freed from your body, and your spirit is sort of just hanging around, and there's people who can communicate with it. This is a very dumbed down version of their movement and what they were teaching, but that's the essential idea. And there were certain people, mediums, spiritualists, who could communicate with those spirits through different ways. Started doing seances. By the way, seances were not created by the spiritualists. They existed a lot longer before that, but they sort of fell out of vogue. So we're just talking about old things that are sort of being rediscovered and presented in new ways, and that's what the spiritualist movement was. You might be asking, what the hell does this have to do with Houdini? Houdini was very curious about the supernatural. He was very intrigued by it, and he wanted to know if this was real or not. And before him, Harry Keller was also very interested in the spiritualist movement, and they would debunk fake psychics, fake mediums. Harry Keller used to do it, and Harry Keller was able to debunk every single spiritualist he ever met, except for one. There was a psychic, I forget the details, but it's in the Mike Caveney book, that Harry Keller could not figure out how they were doing what they were doing. And we know this because he wrote it in a letter to Houdini. He may have also wrote it in his diaries, but he definitely let Houdini know about it. And Houdini spent his life trying to see if there were people who actually could have psychic powers, if people, if the dead do come back, if people could actually communicate with them. And why this becomes important in Houdini's life is we fast forward a couple of years, Houdini is successful, and we're going to talk about how Houdini became successful. But we're sort of skipping ahead because there's so many facets to the Houdini story. But Houdini's mother died, and when Houdini's mother died, he knew some of these spiritualists, and Houdini was inconsolable. He was extremely depressed when his mother died. And they approached him and they said, Houdini, your mother isn't really gone. We can communicate with her. Would you like to try? And Houdini was very emotionally vulnerable, so he really took what they were saying seriously. He really took it to heart, and he listened to them, and he started learning about spiritualism. And one of them did a seance for him once. They were trying to communicate Houdini's dead mother, and Houdini was believing it. He was really into it. And then the spiritualist said something that sort of shook him up, and he's like, wait a second. The spiritualist was supposedly channeling Houdini's mother, and she called him Harry instead of Eric. His mother always called him Eric, but nobody knew Houdini's real name because he was a performer, Harry Houdini. They just thought his name was Harry. So that threw him off when the spirit of Houdini's mother was calling him Harry. Harry's like, that's weird. And he started to investigate it and going further and further. And he found that these people were just lying. They were just using cold reading techniques. They were using hot reading techniques, which is when somebody does research into you and they have information that they later give to you in a reading. And he was finding all this stuff out about these mediums that he knew, and the magical elements that they were presenting in their seances, in their dark rooms, where they were making the room go dark and mysterious things were happening in the dark, such as things moving across the room, instruments playing by themselves, writing appearing on paper in the dark. Houdini started to look at the stuff critically and was actually finding out that these were all magic tricks. These were all fakers. And he, I think, was extremely disturbed by this. And he found out as much as he could. And at a certain point in his career, he started speaking out against these people who, at that time, were very popular. In the 1910s, 1920s, were very popular. One of the presidents, I believe it was President Harding in the U.S., had a child that died, and there were rumors, and I think they were true, but there were rumors of the president and his wife with spiritualists conducting actual seances in the White House. So this was not like a fringe movement. This was something that was becoming mainstream. A lot of people knew about it. A lot of people were getting sucked into, and they were being asked to give over their money to these fake psychics and fake mediums to communicate with their loved ones who were dead. And this bothered Houdini, and he declared an all-out war. And very interesting as we come closer to his death in the story, which is later on, that he had all these enemies and that he was exposing them, but he had these enemies. And his show at this later point of his life was sort of one part spiritualism, where he was demonstrating it, so it seemed totally real, and then he was exposing it, and then he would do the magic, and then he would do the escapes. I'm not too sure the order, but uh, it was a combination of those three things: the spiritualism, the magic, and the escapes in his later life. Houdini, one of the subjects of the book, and one of the things they explore is Houdini's ties to the intelligence community. Um, Back then, the intelligence community was not what it is now, where you have like the CIA and different branches of the intelligence services in different countries where people are recruited and they become case officers. Back then, intelligence was a branch of military, and they did not have spies like we have spies now. The spies were basically, some of the spies were legit, like full on spies, career spies, but a lot of these people who were traveling abroad, like Houdini, who had a lot of high connections to different performers, different politicians, different people in high society, were asked secretly to give information to their government to pass it along. And the book explores uh, the relationship in between Houdini and the first M. If you know M from the James Bond novels, and it's inspired by the real guy who inspired who created the intelligence services in the UK, who was the first, I guess, the founder of what is now known as the different MI, MI5, MI6, MI, so on. But the guy's name, his code name was M, and there is a lot of evidence that Houdini communicated with him and was passing along messages, which would also explain partly his connections with some of the police services in the world, and how easily he was able to work in some of these prisons and with some of these police departments. They were all very well connected. It's not like it's run today where the intelligence service is its own thing. The intelligence services back then were very tied to the police. I mean, this is a time where intelligence services did not exist in the capacity that they exist now. They were quite different, and they were very much tied to law enforcement. Whereas now it's totally a different story. In most countries, anyways. Some countries they still are tied to law enforcement, but now they're sort of their own organizations. But the book does explore that, and it is quite interesting to read about. So uh, it is very possible that Houdini was a spy. Um, I mean, he was the guy. The guy M. His name was William Melville. He was. I don't know what Melville's full um, career, but he was a head of Scotland Yard Special Branch back in the late 1800s, and he he was the precursor to what is now, what are now the military and not private, the law enforcement intelligence agencies. Um, it's pretty interesting story. I can't go into all of it because there's so many details, but it is pretty interesting. And Melville's diaries, by the way, M's diaries, are documented, and there's now that all that time is over, they have published a lot about his life, and there are several entries into his diary about meeting an HH. You know, the diary entry was he was meeting HH, which coincided to Harry Houdini's time in these places. So basically, he knew Harry Houdini. I mean, it's a very big possibility. Um, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence in the book to allude to that. Fast forwarding to down Houdini's career, Houdini was becoming popular, but he was not big. He performed in a lot of places. He had to leave the U.S. to really become popular. All the time he was performing in the U.S., he was successful. He was sort of making his career, but he wasn't big. Business was good, but it wasn't great. He wasn't a superstar. He was a star, but he wasn't like a superstar. He was making good money, but he wasn't what he would later become. And Houdini really made his name for himself, traveling the world, performing for royalty, and really just creating an amazing show wherever he went. Really just touring the world, escaping jails, doing his straitjacket escapes. Houdini was always working. He was always inventing new escapes and new ways to get publicity, new challenges, as he called them. Um, there's an interesting story, a little side plot of him going to Russia and so impressing the Russian aristocracy that they wanted to actually replace him. They actually wanted to replace Rasputin with Houdini. And it's quite interesting, that story. There's a lot of interesting stories like that in this book. Um, Houdini sort of became a superstar, big superstar, when he went to the UK. The story, I mean, this book ties it to the Mirror Cuff Challenge. And so the Daily Mirror, I think it's called the Daily Mirror. I want to make sure that I'm getting the title of the newspaper. No, the Daily Illustrated Mirror, which was the big newspaper in the UK at that time, had a challenge with him. Houdini had a challenge for a long time in a show at that point, where somebody could come to the show and bring him a set of handcuffs or rope or anything. And as long as he could examine it on stage and make sure that the key and the lock worked and wasn't like a busted up handcuff that would just lock and never be able to open again, that he would take that challenge onto him. So the Daily Illustrated Mirror hired, by the way, before we get into the Daily Mirror, also lock companies and safe companies at that time were also big. It's not like it is nowadays. People would show off their locks and their safes and as like a public exhibition thing. It would be like, check this out. We are a new bank in town and we have the best safes. If you give your money to us, we're going to keep it safe. And they would show off their safes in public, and they would have challenges. If anybody can crack this lock, if anybody can crack this safe, we'll give you $10,000 or whatever the price was. There was prize money so that the best safe crackers and the people who really knew about locks could come and try to crack these safes open and these different locks open. And Houdini would work with a lot of these companies to promote himself. He would say, I'll be locked into the safe, and he would escape from the safe. So there was a lot of promotion with those businesses, and he knew a lot of. Houdini was actually one of his first jobs was as a locksmith. He was an apprentice to a locksmith. I'm not too sure the whole story. He didn't do it for too long, but he had a lifelong passion for locks, and he really knew about locks. And everywhere that he would travel in the world, he would buy up every single lock from those different places. And Houdini was familiar with every single type of lock and handcuff and safe in the world. He was not like a faker who just went on stage with one pair of rigged handcuffs and had a secret key, and he actually knew about every single lock on the planet, and he knew how to pick locks and open different types of locks and design locks. one of the funny stories in the show is somebody's trying to track him with a I forget what it's called, but it's a special. It's called a rotation lock. You've ever seen? You probably have seen them nowadays, where it has several numbers on it, like a 1 to 9, and you sort of flip through, and you have to put the right code. So it's like you put a 2, and then there's another dial underneath, and on that dial you put like a 6, and then there's another dial underneath, and you put the correct number on that too, and then it opens. They used to have longer dials on some of these locks. They still do nowadays, where you can have letters. And I forget the story, but it's in the book. It's quite funny, where somebody's trying to trick Houdini with this, and he actually redesigns it with a new combination because he knows the lock so well to say something else. The actual passcode is a different word, and it's a pretty funny story. It's in the book. I don't remember the story, but I know that it's in there. Um, Going back to the Daily Mirror challenge, the Daily Mirror uh, hired, I forget the guy's name, but one of the greatest lock designers in the world, and he had designed a special set of handcuffs for Houdini, and this was supposed to be unbreakable. I don't know the whole details of the lock, but it was supposed to be unbreakable by the way the lock was designed inside the handcuffs were designed. The book spends a lot of time talking about this, and Houdini, this was a total stunt with Houdini, with in collusion with the newspaper company and the lock builder, and they really made a spectacle out of it with weeks and weeks of publicity building up this incredible stunt and bringing a committee of dozens and dozens of people on stage. Houdini was locked into the handcuffs. He then went behind a curtain. There was a curtain on stage that had 4 walls, so it was just a small curtain with a stool inside, so he could sit down. And it was a small area, not that big. It was like this big, maybe, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was not that big. It was a small area, and he had a committee of spectators from the audience standing all around it, so that there was no chance of him, escaping through the back or anything. He was really in this, inside of this curtain, working on this, and they played music and stuff. And the committee was up there for a very long time. I'm not too sure how long. Again, I forget the details. Read the book. But he was in there for quite a long time, and he came out like half an hour into the stunt, and his jacket is like ripped off, and he's bleeding, and he asked somebody to please, cut off his jacket. So they get a pair of scissors and they cut the jacket off him. So now he's like shirtless, and he goes back inside and he's handcuffed, shirtless. They cut the jacket off him, and then he's working and working on it. And then at the end, after a very long time has passed, he falls through the curtains. His arms are bleeding. He's sweating. He looks like he's just went 12 rounds with a boxer. His skin is torn off. He's holding this pair of handcuffs. And for those of you who might be thinking, hold on a second, well, anybody could hide a key on their person, when Houdini would escape from these challenges, not on stage, he wouldn't get naked on stage, but he would strip down on stage. But when he would do the prison escapes, when he was actually locked into a jail cell, they would put him in like a real prisoner where you get completely naked, and they check everywhere to make sure you don't have any extra keys on you or anything hidden in your clothes and your wherever, whatever it is that you have. So Houdini was actually stripped totally naked for some of these for some of these escapes. And there's actually photos of him. They're sort of covering his private parts, but there are photos of Houdini like totally naked, tied up in a jail cell. If you if you happen to want to search for those online, they're available. Um, yeah, it's just such an interesting story, such an interesting guy. After that Daily Mirror challenge, the Daily Illustrated Mirror challenge, when he came out, the sensation that he was, and I'm not telling the story properly, you have to read the book. When he did that, the sensation he created in the audience was just unbelievable. They literally lifted him up in the air and celebrated and carried him marching through the streets, parading him as a hero, bringing him all the way to his hotel. They literally carried him on their shoulders to the hotel, and then they stayed there for about, I think it's an hour and a half to 2 hours, just cheering, and he had to send them home because they were just cheering for him. You think, my goodness, how does how does somebody get a how does somebody get a reaction like that? And you kind of, it's kind of hard for us as magicians to imagine that, because I don't think we've ever seen that in magic in our experience. But you can imagine it if you think of a guy like Michael Jackson, or one of the big pop stars, one of the big music stars, and the fans just going totally crazy, passing out when they see them, wanting to chase them, and the security. I mean, that's not how it was with Houdini. I don't think people were passing out, but for you to get a sensation, I think it was close to that level of hysteria after his show. They absolutely were in love with him, and they were just, you know, we can't really imagine in magic because it's sort of outside of our experience. We've never seen a magician like that in our time. But if you look at the people who are in music, who are doing these concerts, and they're beloved all over the world, and there's diehard fans who are just going crazy, standing in the rain, standing in the snow for hours cheering, I think you can sort of get a sense of what Houdini was creating in some of his shows. I don't think it was like that in every show, but in some of his shows and challenges, you see photographs of him doing a handcuffed and chained bridge jump, and there's tens of thousands of people lining up on the bridge all along the coast, everywhere to watch him. The same thing when he did straitjackets escapes, tens of thousands of people in the streets, packed closely together, standing, everyone watching as far as the eye could see, to see him doing these stunts. You have to think, they didn't have TV back then. They didn't have the media the same way that we did. And people were really going out of their way to have a live experience with this famous person, this world legend. And the only thing I could probably compare it to these days would be music concerts, or if you see, for example, in the US, Donald Trump, when he was running for president, was having these rallies, and there would be 30,000 people showing up, sometimes more, 30,000 people. And let me tell you, I've just done a show in Shanghai, and the audience had 10,000 people in it. I cannot imagine 30,000 people. It's crazy to think about. But Houdini was getting some of these level of crowd sizes to come out for his stunts. Just to give you an idea of what he was creating for people, the sensations, the spectacle, the show. There's so much to say about Houdini. This is a really great book. It's one of my favorite books in magic. I got to reread it recently, to prepare for this book club, but it is really one of my favorite favorite books. It's such a good book, and Houdini's life is so inspiring. Like Houdini, I think people give Houdini a bad rap today in magic. Magicians don't take Houdini as seriously as they should. I think a lot of that is due to Di Vernon and some of the magicians who came after Houdini. But I think a lot of it has to do with Di Vernon, who just totally knocked Houdini, was always putting him down. And Di Vernon was looked up to by a lot of magicians. So they just sort of copied and parroted what he said about Houdini, and people stopped taking Houdini seriously. You have to consider that Houdini was the most famous magician in the world, I think, of all time. Even though we have a larger population size, we have TV. I perform for more people than Houdini. More people have heard about me than Houdini. But doesn't matter. Houdini, for his time, was, I mean, he was world renowned. It was a different level, and his name is in the vernacular. I mean, people know the name Houdini. People use the word Houdini to describe things, to describe people, to describe animals. Oh, this dog is a Houdini. He keeps escaping from his cage. Or even companies. I've seen many products on the market called the Houdini this, the Houdini that. I saw recently the Houdini jacket by Patagonia, which is a outdoor clothing company. They have a Houdini jacket, which is a jacket that you can hide away in a little pouch, and it folds up really small. And they call it the Houdini jacket. Houdini was so famous that everybody knew his name and everybody knew who he was and what he did. And I think that's very important to realize when we talk about Houdini, the impact that he had. He was an incredible magician. Now, a lot of different people at different time comment on his techniques. You kind of read the old magic magazine, read Conjurer's monthly. What is it called? Conjurer's Magic Monthly. There's an old magazine back in those days, magic magazine called, I think it was called Conjurer's Monthly. And you also have the Sphinx, which was a magic magazine. You also have Mahatma. You have a few magazines from that era that talk about Houdini, and Houdini even submitted articles and edited. I think Houdini edited the Sphinx. Anyways, you can read about guys who were actually there at the time of Houdini, what they actually thought about him and his show. It's very well documented. Houdini was incredible. He was well respected by all of his peers. And I just think the story is just so magical, so inspiring. It really is all around the world. And he really did interact with so many people from different walks of life. Houdini was the first person he was one of the first people in the US to have a movie company. A lot of people don't know that. Houdini had a movie company. He was the first to make films. He spent a lot of money trying to make films. Houdini was the first person to fly an airplane in Australia. Houdini had a lot of interests in different areas, and in history he wrote several books. Some of them were ghostwritten. He had help with some of them, but he was a historian. He was an incredibly smart guy, and he was very good at what he did and very successful, and just a huge star. There's so much to talk about Houdini. I could really sit here and have a discussion on Houdini. And some of my friends, one of my favorite things in the world is to meet other people who know a lot about Houdini, because I've read so much about Houdini, and it's really cool to talk about Houdini's life with people who know about Houdini's life, because it's just such an amazing story. And his magic was amazing. Um, yeah, this is a great book. One of the things this book really explores is his connection to the spiritualism world, which is, we talked about it briefly earlier. At the end of his life, they really hated him, and they were conspiring to kill him. They were actually praying for his death. They were performing black magic rituals, wishing for Harry Houdini's death. They were very creepy. One of the guys, you'll read it in the book, but it's very creepy. He's involved with uh, many children disappearing, and then they later find bones of children in relation to him. So Houdini was up against some really bizarre and creepy characters who were involved in some pretty dark stuff. But the book goes into that, and it's very interesting research, and very very inspiring story, but at the same time very tragic story. Houdini died uh, much earlier than he should have died, and his wife Bess, who was part of the show for so long and who contributed so much to his life, ended up in a really bad spot afterwards. She was targeted by the spiritualists because they wanted to win a victory after Houdini's death by claiming that Houdini came back in a seance to Bess, and they wanted to prove it. So they sent this really creepy guy, Arthur Ford, I think his name was Arthur Ford, to seduce Bess. And he pretended to be her friend. He seduced her. He got her addicted to drugs and to alcohol. And the spiritualist movement used her, totally used her for propaganda, saying, yeah, Houdini came back. He's communicating with her through Arthur Ford. And after they were done with her, she was just a total mess. She ended up in for some time in a mental hospital, Houdini's wife, after all that. And she was actually helped by some of the magicians who looked out for her, and some people who were really good and entered her life after that. But it's a tragic story. It's a very interesting story on many, many, many levels. If you guys have not read this book, if you have never read a book on Houdini, get this book. Just buy it. It'll cost you, let's see, Secret Life of Houdini. It goes for, you can get it anywhere from $4 used to a new copy, which will be about $20. That's for the soft cover. If you want to get the hardcover, it'll be a little bit more. There's also a Kindle edition if you do e-reading. But it really is worth it. This is one of the best books on magic that I've ever read. Houdini's story is incredible, and just read it. You won't regret it. Just get the book, read it, and you will love it. And you will actually fall in love with Houdini. You might have never cared about Houdini. I never really cared about Houdini before I read this book. I was sort of interested in Houdini, but I had never approached the subject of Houdini. I had never really read much about him until I read this book. And this book made me fall in love with Houdini. So I really hope you can get some of what I got out of reading this book. It really is a pleasure sharing with you. Just talking about it gets me excited. It's just inspiring. It really is. So, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this live stream. This is our October book club, and I'm hoping next month we are on track. I will send you guys a message in the Patreon, trying to get back on track. As I explained, we had a few delays because I was in China. Then when I got home, I was sick, and I was sort of out of focusing on doing this big performance, this big show which kind of rattled me. It's very different. My regular show, I don't need to think about it. I just, boom, I do it. I know it. But this sort of rattled me and got me distracted for a little bit while, but I'm glad to say I'm back. I'm really excited to be working on Magic with you guys, sharing this kind of stuff. I really live to share it, and I do want to thank you, as always, for supporting the Patreons, for supporting these live streams, and the things that I do. Even if your support can be in many ways: buying things, subscribing, but even taking part in these live streams and communicating and just interacting with what I put out is just helps Magic. It just helps Magic. It makes Magic better. It creates a dialogue. It just is moving Magic towards a better place. So I really do want to thank you guys, as always, for your continued support. I will see you guys soon. I know that we have a Studies of Magic live stream to do as well. I will be doing that soon. Not today, but soon. Anyways, I will keep all you guys updated on the dates and everything. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.